Okay.
I don't know how you get the screen to come to me, or perhaps it has.
I can see you.
Good. Okay. Right. I think Duncan's covered most of the housekeeping. Well, first, welcome everybody who's here. I think everybody. Can you turn your videos off if you haven't, Jane? I can see yours, but I don't know who else. Yeah, Julia will stay. I think probably we all have to, including other than Ian, for the recording. And it just comes then to introduce Ian. Now, I'm sure many of you will already know Ian through his position on the L panel for his amazing eye at checking processing defects in work. You may not have wanted that at advisory days, but we always marvel at it. Or as also as the previous regional organiser for East Anglia. He has an enormous knowledge about all things to do with computers and imaging, but he's always willing to help people. It's definitely the case that if you don't know something yourself to do with photography or computers, then to quote a well-known phrase, I know someone who does, and Ian is that man. I will leave Ian to tell you how he's going to approach the subject of getting the best of your images. So over to you, Ian, and I will.
Yes, thank you.
Video.
Thank you, Anne, and good afternoon, and thanks for joining. It's you can't see out of my window. I can see a clear blue sky and sunshine, and it's absolutely glorious here. So thank you for giving up that time, and particularly to John Ballpit, thank you for not drinking your wine yet. That's very nice of you. I looked at the list of people coming. I recognise a lot of the names on the list. For those who don't know me, I'm actually more of a general photographer. I'm not a nature specialist. I suspect there are quite a lot of people on the list who are nature specialists. I'm not. But I'm a general photographer who loves to do nature. And one of the reasons I do love to do nature, I'm just going to let me share my screen as well, so you've got something different to have a look at. So we want to go to share one, share. You should see a picture of two dogs, all being well. Everybody seeing a picture of two dogs? Hopefully, no, that's not working. Is that working?
Yeah, I can see it. Yes.
Yeah. Splendid. Okay, good. That means you're getting that one. So one of the things I absolutely love about nature when processing nature is the fact it's very quick. And it's very quick because you really aren't allowed to do very much. So you're working within rather tight constraints in that you're allowed to do things like remove dust spots, you're allowed to crop, you're allowed to do leveling, you can adjust tonal range, so brightness, contrast, and you can do that either globally or selectively. You can adjust color. So white balance or color adjustments, either globally or selectively. You can do sharpening and noise reduction, again, globally or selectively. And that's about it. There really aren't many other things that you can do. And that is nice because it means you are constrained into the kind of things you can do. And that cuts down the options. And as a result, it makes things a lot speedier. It also means that you can develop a consistent workflow. And having got used to that workflow, you can then rattle through images one after the other. And so everything becomes that much quicker. So that's one of the things I actually really love about processing nature as opposed to other types of pictures. And the other thing I love about nature is that it values accuracy over Photoshop wizardry. Unlike other photographic organizations one might mention at this point, but I'm not going to say anything else. Right, okay, let's see where we are. So, I'm going to be using primarily Lightroom and Photoshop today, although of course there are plenty of other raw converters available. Yeah, I myself don't really use Lightroom anymore. I tend to use Capture One, mainly because I've got Fuji cameras and Capture One does a better job with that one. So I'm going to be using Lightroom for organization and for raw conversion. I will also, because it was advertised on at least one occasion, I'll go into Adobe Camera Raw just to show that it is no difference to Lightroom. The Lightroom Develop module and Adobe Camera Raw are one and the same. They just have a slightly different user interface, that's all. So I'm going to be using Photoshop, and I'm also going to be using a small number of plugins. The one that the plugin set that I use a lot comes from Nick. Nick have just released a new version. I did wonder this morning about downloading the new version. I thought perhaps downloading a new version immediately prior to a demonstration was not a good idea. So I didn't do that one. So I'll still be using the previous version. And the other one, which I've been recently recommended to and started playing with, is the Topaz Denoise AI, which I am super impressed by. But we'll get onto that a little bit later. Okay, bit of background first of all. For those people that know raw files well and know raw processing well, please, forgive me for teaching you to suck eggs. It's just that some people this may not be obvious. The thing about raw files is that they are very, very different to the kind of cooked files that we work with in Photoshop and that we're used to. And there are basically three major differences. The first is in how the pixels are laid out. I'm just going to show you this one to go full screen. Yeah, that's a representation of the kind of pixels that we're used to. We're used to seeing an array of pixels where every pixel site has a red and a green and a blue value. Okay, so and it's the combination of both red, green, and blue values that give us the brightness and they give us the color. And that's what we're used to working with. Unfortunately, that's not what sensors are like. Your sensor almost certainly looks like that. So rather than having sites which are red and green and blue, each one is either red or green or blue. Now that's a classic Bayer arrangement, and it's a repeating 2x2 pattern. If you look in the top left-hand corner, I've highlighted a set. It's a repeating set of 2x2 all the way across. So that is the that's what a normal Bayer camera looks like, and it is a very, very closely packed repeating pattern, and as a result it suffers very badly from worry effects, which are those strange patterns you get, the curvy patterns, interference patterns when you photograph something with a very, very fine detail. And as a result, most cameras that have a Bayer sensor also have a thing called an anti-alias filter, which is a blurring filter on the front to try and get around that one. So that's what a Bayer sensor looks like. If you have a Fuji camera like me, that's what your sensor looks like. It's an X-Trans. And that is a 6x6 repeating pattern rather than a 2x2 repeating pattern. So it's the repeats are much less tightly packed, therefore there's no need for an anti-alias filter. But the bottom line is, whatever your sensor type, you've still got to turn that into, go back again, into that. And that means that you've got to invent 2/3 of the pixels. You've actually got to invent them. It's an operation called a demosaic operation. You go from the raw layout on the sensor to that, which is how we're used to using it. So that's one of the main differences. Another main difference is this one, and that is that we are used to working in Photoshop with a tonality going from black to white, with 0 being black and 255 being white, and mid-gray being right in the middle, 128. All right, now you might wonder why I've put a piano keyboard under there. And the reason I put a piano keyboard on there is it represents very, very accurately, there's a very close analogy between noise and sound and light, in that each one of those blocks, as you go up one tonal step, is actually an octave on the keyboard. And every time you go up an octave on the keyboard, you're actually doubling the frequency. So it isn't a linear movement at all. It's linear in terms of the keys on the keyboard, but it's logarithmic in terms of the frequency. And we know that's how cameras work as well. We know that if you have a brightness value, then a stop brighter than that will be double that value. A stop brighter than that will be double that value again, so 4 times the original, and so on. So light, like sound, is logarithmic, not linear. So that conversion has to happen. So that's actually what the tonal range looks like. So these are not arbitrary numbers based on a 12-bit sensor. This was done some time ago. Most sensors are now well above 12 bits. They're 14 or 16 bits. But you look, half the data is the top stop of exposure. Half of what's left, so a quarter, is the next stop down, half of that, so an eighth is the stop below that, and so on. So in terms of linearity, there's far more information in the highlights than there is in the shadows. This is, of course, why you get more noise in the shadows. All right, because you've got far less information available down here, much more information available in the highlights. Okay, so so essentially, when you the top thing is what we're used to working with in Photoshop. So you've got to take the small sliver down there and move it up to that block, and this enormous chunk up there and move it to that block up there. So that's when you've got to do this conversion, the logarithmic to the linear conversion. Okay, so that's another major change. And the third one, of course, is color. And when we're working, when you capture a raw file, you are getting the raw color straight off the sensor. No color profile applied, no nothing. And you then, as you go into a raw processor, A, you've got to interpret the color that comes off the sensor, and B, when you take that file and move it into something else, like into Photoshop or wherever, you've actually got to apply a color profile to that one. So three different things. So all right so far? Let's move on because we really want to do some examples. So those are the main differences. So we are working in essentially two different parts of the world. We're working in the raw converter, Lightroom or ACR, which is working on the raw file. When we get into Photoshop, we're working on the cooked file. So a cooked file has got all 3 pixel sites filled. It's got a linear tonal range. And it will have a color profile applied. So you've got a choice between which you do in which world. So normally what I would suggest is you do all your major tonal and color adjustments, leveling, cropping, anything like that. You try and do those in the raw converter, because as you move out of the raw converter into Photoshop, you have to recreate the pixels. You have to rewrite them. And every time you recreate the pixels, you lose quality. So the minimum number of times you can change that, the better. Right, so I would do all that there. There's then a choice between a split as to which you do in Photoshop and which you do in the raw converter. Things like spot removal, you could do in the raw converter. I tend to do that in Photoshop, but that's entirely up to you. If I'm producing things for a blog, website, things like that, I'll do everything in the raw converter. If I'm going to produce a print, and I am a print worker, then everything I'm going to print, I will go through the Photoshop route, and that's what I'm going to be demonstrating today. Okay, right, so before we start, there's a little bit of setup you need to do. And it's one of those things that once you've got it set up once, you don't need to touch it. But it's worth getting the setup right, because if it's wrong, it'll be wrong for every image. All right, so within Lightroom, there's a little bit of setup to do. First thing is not critical, but it's something I would recommend. And that's under the edit menu, or I don't know what it is on a Mac. It's probably under the Lightroom menu on a Mac. There's a thing called catalog settings. And under catalog settings, the metadata tab, there is a setting which is not on by default, and I think it should be. It's one called automatically write changes into XMP. By default in Lightroom, the edits that you make to a file will only be written into the catalog. And that means if you lose your catalog or you copy your file elsewhere, then you are not copying the edits with it. If you check that box, then what it will do is it will write a separate XMP, a sidecar file, alongside your raw. That can then be copied onto another computer or backed up or wherever, and it's completely independent of your Lightroom catalog. So that's a simple belt and braces check, which I would always have. So that's the first thing. Okay. The other thing to look at are the camera defaults. Now, as I said, I don't use Lightroom anymore, really, for editing purposes. But I just checked this morning that I could still do this, and it doesn't work. They've changed it. They've changed it all. Now, these are the per camera defaults. Basically, are what Lightroom or actually applies to the image as you bring the image into the catalog. So there are a few default base settings, and there are a few things which unfortunately are not on by default, and they probably ought to be. And they're down here, they're in the details section. All right, in the details, not the details section, they're in the lens correction section. And there are these two here. Remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And you really should have those on by default. Remove chromatic aberration, I hope everybody knows what that is, where you get color fringes around sharp edges. Profile corrections, I don't know if you can see what's happening when I'm turning that on and off, but what that will do is it will remove any barrel or pincushion distortion that your lens has. So why anybody would not want to apply that, I can't imagine. So I would have that set up. Now, you either got to go in and do that for every image, or you can set it up as a default. Now, you used to be able to hold the Alt key down and the reset button changed into a set default. They've changed that, I discovered. Now what you have to do is go under Edit Preferences very quickly, Edit Preferences, Presets, and then under Master, Camera Settings, and you've got to save this as a preset and then apply it here as a default. All right, I'm not going to give, there's plenty of ways of doing this. You can find this out online, but I would suggest that you do this, that these are turned on by default so that whenever you reset an image or whenever you bring it into the Lightroom catalog, it enables those things by default. Okay, so there's that one. The other one that's really important, this is as we go from Lightroom into Photoshop, and that is, go to Edit Preferences again, and it's under the External Editing tab. And this is what the external file format is, the color space is, and the bit depth. Ignore resolution, that's just a piece of metadata. It's just a number which is stored in the file. Within Photoshop, I always work with PSDs. A PSD is just a special kind of TIFF. There's nothing particularly clever about a PSD. It's just an Adobe proprietary version of TIFF. Okay, so there's not a great deal to be gained by going with TIFF as opposed to PSD. Everything you know is going to work if you have a PSD file. Color space. If you're in Lightroom, the default color space is ProPhoto RGB. I would very much advise going against that one. It's too wide. This is to do with how many colors the color space is capable of rendering. ProPhoto can render far more colors than your average monitor can display, and more than your average printer can print. So it's a little bit pointless having colors in your file that you are not seeing accurately on your screen. So I would always suggest go Adobe RGB. That is a way of guaranteeing that pretty well every color within Adobe RGB will be visible on a good monitor. And Adobe RGB covers pretty well all the gamut of most printers as well. So it's a good, sensible one. I would not use sRGB at this stage. sRGB is for later when you are converting for projection or web. So stick to something like Adobe RGB. And the other thing to remember here, I personally would stick to 16 bits per component. The only reason not to do that is if you are a user of Photoshop Elements only. So if you're a user of Photoshop Elements, then Elements only supports 8-bit working. But if you're not an Elements user, if you're the full version of Photoshop, use 16 bits. It will give you far more accuracy. It won't give you more tonal range, but it will give you more accuracy in how all the colors and the tones are rendered. So those things want to be set up. Okay, so those are. I'll show you how to set up the basic stuff in Photoshop when we get in there. But that's how you would set up Lightroom. Okay, so let's start. Right, so let's start with an image, and we'll start with this one, number 1 on the song sheet. And the first thing you need to be aware of, and I'm sure you all are, is for heaven's sake, don't judge an image by its raw. You know, raws can look terribly dull and terribly bad, and it's ever so tempting to discard them because they look grim. Yeah, that was taken after the sun had gone down. Horrendous blue color cast, and yeah, that one, okay, it's reasonably well exposed. There's another one here which is actually underexposed. You think, oh, just bin it. Well, actually, there's a huge amount of information in there, and it's very, very easy to get it back. So don't judge a file by what you see in the raw. All right, so let's go back. What's the workflow? my workflow, the first thing I would always do is set the color profile. Now, this is not a monitor color profile. This is not a printing color profile. It's not an embedded color profile. What this is a camera interpretation color profile. So what you've got your raw color coming off the camera, and that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. You know, a color profile is just a way of translating from one color to another color. That's all it is. And by default, it comes in with a thing called Adobe Color. So that's what it would look like by default out of the box, as it were. I tend to go for one of the camera matching ones. So in this case, we've got, I'll hover my mouse over. Hopefully you will see the difference as I move around. So this is taken on a Fuji camera. So these are the film simulations for Fuji. When I do this on a Canon file, which I will do later, you'll see Canon camera profiles here. So that's what Aspia looks like. That's classic chrome. It looks horrendously cyan as a result. That looks very blue. That looks very cyan. ProNeg High, ProNeg Standard, Provia, which is their standard one, Velvia, super saturated, and various monochrome ones. So in this case, I would probably use the Provia standard setting. It's a starting point. Choose whichever one gives you the best starting point for your image, okay? In terms of the basic color and the contrast, right? Because they will boost different colors, different blues, greens, reds, whatever. So we'll see that more clearly when we go into the Canon file. So that's the first stage. First stage is to get the color profile right. I will then tend to play around with the exposure and the white balance. Now, one of the big mistakes. In fact, there are two major mistakes that people make when they're editing all files, not just nature files. The big one they make is they believe what they see on the screen. And you shouldn't. They trust their eyes. You shouldn't trust your eyes, because our eyes do not see accurate color and accurate tone. They see relative color and relative tone. Now, one of the things you may have noticed is the fact that I've got a white background on this image. Now, I've got a white background because I tend to work with prints. All right, and these are going to be printed on white paper. So I want to know what the tonality of the image looks like on paper. If I were projecting this, I would right-click there and go to black. All right, and you can actually go to full screen and it will show you, or you can hide the images. Hide that. Come on, go away. There we are. Hopefully you'll get some idea of what it might look like against a black or a white background. You get the idea. So choice of background color is actually quite important. So I tend to use white for white because I'm printing. It helps you to judge the white balance. It also helps you to judge whether your image has a full tonal range. You must use your histogram. All right, histograms don't lie. Even if your monitor's not calibrated, your histogram will be accurate. Okay, so that's worth remembering. So this one, let's have a quick look. We need to get a correct white balance. On the whole, clouds tend to be a neutral color. So let's go up here and let's find something that's relatively neutral. That's way too yellow as it happens. Let's pull that one back a little bit until we get something that's a little bit closer to what we want to do. Now let's get the tonality right. So one of the lovely things about working in the raw converter is it doesn't matter what order you do any of these things in, because the order you do them in is not the same in the order they'll be applied in when they get moved, when the file gets moved into Photoshop. So you can play around to your heart's content. So in this case, I'm moving the exposure as hopefully if you watch the histogram, you'll see the histogram move to the right as I push the exposure up. So I'm pushing the highlights up here. I'll get the midtones about right. I'm now going to make sure I pull the shadows down a bit, just to try and give it some contrast. Now we're looking for clipping. Clipping is where blacks go to solid black. So if I move the blacks right down, you can see those areas. I'm holding the Alt key down, by the way. In general, on all Adobe software, if you hold the Alt key down, it will show you what's being clipped. So I want to make that so it's just starting to clip. I want a full tonal range. So something about like that. Maybe pull that up a bit. I want to make sure I've got something close to a pure white, but not completely blown. So something a bit like that. Maybe put the contrast up very slightly. And maybe apply a tiny bit of clarity. Right, so again, look, these triangles up here tell you what's clipped, by the way. That's what they... All right, so first step is to end up with an image. All I was doing was moving these sliders, nudging them backwards and forwards until I managed to get the histogram where I wanted it. And so so I've got effectively a full tonal range. You can see this. I've got going all the way from pretty well pure white to pure black. I've got the color pretty accurate. Let's just see if we can make it slightly better. That's looking about right. Okay. And that's about as far as I would normally go in terms of tonal processing. And you'll see that as we go through the other images. That's really all you need to do. You can't do a great deal more. We're working globally here, remember, and this particular image doesn't require a lot of selective adjustments. I might darken the sky down a little bit. In fact, we'll do that now just to show, because this is one thing that's allowed. I might apply a grad to the sky. So I'm just going to apply just going to bring the highlights down just a tiny little bit on that other part. There we go, something a bit like that. Okay. So we have set the basic color, the color profile. We've set the white balance. We've set the basic tonality, and we've moved the controls around until we get the histogram that we want with everything in roughly the right tonal place. So this is the point at which you would consider handing over from Lightroom to Photoshop. Now, if I were doing this entirely for web, I would do sharpening here, I would do noise reduction here, I might apply a vignette here, but I'm going to go for print. So this one I'm going to take into Photoshop. You'll see I'll do the same with 2 or 3 other images. I won't do the explanations with them. It'll be a lot quicker, but you'll get the idea of why I split where I do. Now, on this particular image, there's no cropping, there's no leveling involved, and there's no spot removal either. But you could, if you wanted to, remove spots here, or you could remove them in Photoshop. The choice is entirely up to you. I would tend to leave it later. Okay, right, let's get into Photoshop. And the issue we've got here is that Lightroom and most raw converters apply sharpening by default, and a little bit of noise reduction as well. Now, we want to apply sharpening and noise reduction intelligently. And to do that, we want to turn off the sharpening here, and possibly some of the noise reduction as well. Going to go down to the Detail tab, and I'm just going to take the sharpening slider and move it down to 0. That just turns the sharpening off. Incidentally, don't click that button there. That turns off both sharpening and noise reduction. This just disables the sharpening. Noise reduction is set to 0 by default. It's applying a small amount of color noise reduction. Have a look in the shadows. Normally the default is okay. With Fuji files, there's very little color noise. Anyway, you can probably take that down to maybe 15, 10. I'm going to leave it where it is because there's no obvious color noise there. But the important thing is the file we're taking into Photoshop has no sharpening applied. This is absolutely critical. So I'm going to edit that in, if I can find it. I always do this by shortcut, which is why I'm struggling to find trying to find the menu. Right click, edit in, Adobe Photoshop. So hopefully what that will do is bring it into Photoshop. Same thing in Photoshop, I deliberately left this black to show you that you can do what you like with the background here. And again, you've got black, dark gray, medium gray, light gray, or custom Why white isn't a default, I have no idea, but if you want white, you can set it as a custom. So that's what I've done. And it does make a very big difference what the image looks like against black. It looks much brighter against black than it does against white. Okay, so I tend to work against white. Okay, sharpening noise reduction. I'm going to do it 3 different ways on 3 different pictures, so because you've got a complete choice as to how you do this. This one I'm going to use the technique that I would normally have used with the Nick filters. So the important factors is the same with pretty well all of them, which is that you tend to separate, or it's usually, until quite recently, been beneficial to separate the noise reduction from the sharpening. And that's because the two tend to fight. Noise reduction works on the whole by blurring the image. Blurring the image, okay, it removes noise, but it also removes detail. All right. Sharpening tends to make detail sharper, but it also makes noise sharper, right? So the problem comes that you tend to have these 2 things, and one's pushing and the other one's pulling, and as a result, you end up with mayhem. If you try to mask, which some people do, you then end up with horrible boundaries between bits that are sharpened and bits that aren't sharpened, and you end up with sharpening halos and all sorts. I find it easier to work by keeping the 2 separate and then using Photoshop to mask, a masked blend of the 2. The game has changed with Topaz, and so one of the later images will use Topaz. You can usually do it in a single step with Topaz, as far as I can tell. All right, so this is one way. If you don't have Topaz, don't want to use Topaz, but you do have Nick, then this is what I would suggest. I'm going to bring in the Nick Selective tool. So this allows you to start the different filters. So I'm going to start off by running a noise reduction, which is defined. Now, by default, what the Nick filters will do is they'll create a new layer, and they will fill that layer with a copy of or a flattened copy of what's below, and then it will apply whatever the filter is to that layer and to that layer only. And so you've got a preview here of the noise reduction. In this case, this was an image shot at base ISO. There is very, very little noise. It is worth just having a quick look, but there's precious little noise. The sliders are before, and I don't know if you can see this on Zoom. There's a little bit of noise on the left-hand side. By default, one of the things I find, it tends to remove rather too much noise. So if I'm using this technique, what I tend to do is take that down to about 80%, 75%. I don't like backgrounds that are completely kind of alabaster smooth. I like to see a little bit of texture there. So I tend to bring it down to something like that. All right, at which point you just go, okay. Now, what we've got there now, this is a layer which has been noise reduced, but not sharpened. Okay, so there it is, a layer noise reduced, but not sharpened. The trick with this one is now to hide that layer, because as I explained earlier on, when you run a Nick filter, what it will tend to do is make a flattened version. And if you make a flattened version and you include that layer, you're making a flattened version of the smoothed version, the denoised version. We don't want that. We want it to be the background, the normal one. So now we're going to use the sharp. So this is a layer which is going to be sharpened but not noise reduced. And for that, I would use the raw pre-sharpener. So what this will do, hopefully we will start up. There we are. So here's the raw pre-sharpener. I should have mentioned sharpening, noise reduction, you should judge them at 100%. Always judge them at 100%. It's one of those things that those lucky people that have got 4K or 5K monitors or UHD monitors will actually struggle with a little bit, because the pixels are packed so tightly that you will struggle to actually differentiate what is noisy, what isn't noisy, what's critically sharp, what isn't critically sharp. It's much easier on an HD monitor, which is what I've got here. So what we've got now is we can now just play around. So I'm looking to try and get the sharpening right for those areas that I want to be sharpened. Now, bear in mind, we're going to be applying the sharpening selectively. So I'm only interested in looking at the areas, the sharpened areas. Bear in mind, where you've got detail, you tend not to see noise. You tend to see noise most in the very smooth areas. As it happens, this image has got very little noise. It'll be more obvious on one of the noisy images. So in this case, I've just done some basic sharpening, and there we go, okay. So here's the principle. You've got a layer which is sharpened but not noise reduced, and below it, you've got a layer which is noise reduced but not sharpened. Now what that means is if I put a layer mask on the sharpened layer, which I'm going to do now, I can now paint, and I turn that inverse, black. We're not seeing the sharpened, we're only seeing what's below it, we're seeing the noise reduced. Now where I paint in white, we are going to start to see the area which is sharpened. And this is where you can now bring in sharpening only where you need it. Now you can either do it by selection, or you can do it by painting. In this one, I'm going to very quickly do it by selection. I'm going to try selecting roughly that iceberg and this area in the background, because these are the areas that I want roughly sharp. I'm going to take it up there. It's not super critical, as you will get used to a little bit later on. So I'm just going to, no, see it's gone into the water. I don't want to sharpen the water. On the whole, water tends not to be very sharp. So I'm just going to take it away from that. I will do roughly, I'm going to add in this bit down here. Take away the water. We can always go in, it's a mask, we can go away and change this later. Okay, having got roughly a selection that I want, I can now go select and mask, and that's just showing me what's selected. Let me move that out of the way. So you can then tidy up the selection by moving the radius around. Again, if you want to find out about these, there are endless tutorials online about how to use select and mask and this workspace. I'm just showing you my workflow. So you get a reasonably clean edge. You then feather it by a couple of pixels, 2-3 pixels, so that it's not a very, very sharp edge. And then you go, okay. In fact, what I should have done is not apply that mask. I'm just going to delete the layer mask, because normally I would make the selection first and then I would apply the layer mask. So I don't know if you can see that. It has actually turned that selection into a layer mask. I'll show you what the layer mask looks like by alt-clicking it. That is the layer mask. So now, if I go into 100%, you will find that only the area around the iceberg's being sharpened, and the area behind is noise reduced but not sharpened. Okay. All right, so with this image, I happen to know the only other thing that I did to it before I printed it was I put a vignette on it. And in this case, the vignette tool I absolutely love using is in color effects, and it's called darken, light, and center. So I'm going to apply that now. And what that will do, this again will create a new layer. So this is destructive all the way through. It's creating new layers, new copies. Normally set a elliptical vignette, mark the center of the vignette, something like that. You can then play around with the relative brightness of the center of the vignette and the outside, and you can change the size of the vignette. It's a little bit bright in the center, something like that. It's a subtle effect, but it's well worth it. It really does concentrate the viewer's attention on the middle part of the picture. And we go, okay. Okay, job done. That is essentially how I would process that picture as a nature picture. It doesn't, we've done nothing here which is remotely illegal in terms of the nature rules. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to use a slightly same basic technique, but using a different mechanism, and you'll get an idea. At the end, I'll talk about how we would print this and the things that you might want to do to print it. But let's rattle through another one, because if I do 2 or 3, it'll be much more obvious that it's exactly the same workflow with all of them. So let me close that one. We don't want to save that one. Let's do a completely different kind of picture. Let us do a bird. Let's do a bird. Why not? Let's do that one. Okay, so this is again, it's a very dull classic out of the camera raw file, hasn't got a full tonal range, color's not looking too bad. So same basic principle again. This is actually from a Canon camera, so I go to the choice of color profile. I'll show you what Adobe color looks like. So that's Adobe color, all looking rather bland. These are the Canon ones. There is Faithful. Landscape is obviously making the greens much more punchy and the yellows. Neutral, which I find is a really good starting point for nature pictures, the one I would normally use for nature. Portrait, which is punching the reds and the oranges. And Standard, which is quite high contrast. So I would normally start with neutral here. Okay, so where we're at that. So these are just, as I say, just interpreting the color off the camera. So we start off with that one. Crop. One of the reasons I'm going to crop here is, it's less obvious with this picture, is the fact that the histogram you see is the histogram of the cropped image, not the, it's much more obvious if you look at something like this. If you look at the histogram there, look at the shape of it, if I were to now crop that image, you see how the histogram changes. So it's if you're working with the histogram, it's well worth playing around with the crop first, because then the histogram is giving you the accurate representation for the crop that you're working on. So we'll get this one cropped. I'll make sure I'm working in. Again, I'm going to keep the same aspect ratio probably with this one. Something. I want those. Something a bit like that. I seem to remember maybe a little bit down. Comme ça. So we're cropped in. This was shot at higher ISO. I don't know if you can see, there's quite a bit of noise in the smooth part of the background, but the bird itself is sharp, and we've got detail on the feathers. Foreground's going soft. That's fine. It's what you expect. It's a long lens shot. So let's get the tonality, let's get the color right and the tonality right. Golden plovers, these feathers are pretty well white or neutral. So I'm going to click on that one. It's gone, it's not doing too badly. Let's get yes, looking all right. So let's get the tonality about right. So let's pull the whites up a little bit and maybe pull the highlights back, because we don't want to lose detail in these breast feathers. I often find I'm doing that. I don't know about other people, I find that I treat these controls as if they're pairs. So whites and highlights tend to go in opposite directions. So if you push the whites up, it's often a good idea to pull the highlights down to compensate, to give you a bit more detail. I'm going to just pull those mid-tones back a little bit. Let's pull the blacks down. If you pull the blacks down too much, then you can push the shadows up slightly to get detail. So again, I tend to find it's worthwhile having a good piece of solid black somewhere in an image. White, less so, but black certainly. Okay. So that is same principle as I had before. All you've done is get the color profile. You set the white point, the black point, the basic tone curve. We've cropped it, and that's really all we've done. Set the white balance. So into Photoshop now. This one I'm going to use it for those of you who don't use the Nik filters and don't own the and don't own Topaz. You can do the noise reduction sharpening trick in Lightroom. All right, and you do it by using the virtual copies, which is where you make essentially a second copy of the instructions for the same raw file. Okay, so in this case we've got this one we've got the base conversion done correctly. So I'm now going to create a virtual copy. I will try and do it in the menu. I can't remember. I always use a shortcut. It's Control apostrophe. Anybody remember what it is here? Image. It's under settings. doesn't matter. I'm going to do it with a shortcut. You'll be able to work out yourself how to do it. It's golden rule, never demonstrate something you don't use yourself. So we've now got two absolutely identical copies down here. Now one of them I am going to noise reduce but not sharpen, and the other one I'm going to sharpen but not noise reduce. So let's this one be the noise reduction one. So I'm going to go into detail. I'm going to turn sharpening to 0, and I'm going to now look at the noise reduction. So I'm going to look at the color noise reduction is fine, but I'm going to push the luminance noise reduction up until such time as it's about right. Don't overdo it. If you overdo it, everything turns to plastic and it's disgusting. So do as little as you can get away with. As I say, I do not mind personally the fact that there's a tiny bit of texture in this background. It's done horrible things to the feathers, but we don't care. All right, so that's the layer that's going to be the layer that is noise reduced but not sharpened. If I move to this layer, what we're going to do now, this copy, what we're going to do now is sharpen it. So I am going to push the sharpening up. Now I tend to find that certainly with biosensors, I prefer a higher sharpening amount and a lower radius. You get a far smaller, but if you get any halos at all, they are so small as to be unnoticeable. So something about like that. I never ever use masking, not if I'm going to take into Photoshop, because what that will do is it will put a boundary between that which is sharpened and that which isn't sharpened, and it's always obvious. So don't do that one. Now that has made a very nice job around the eye, around the beak, around the feathers, but I don't know if you can see this, but it's also increased the noise dramatically on the background. All right, but again, we don't care because we've got that in another image. So what you have to do now is go select both of them, right click, edit in, and one of the options there is open as layers in Photoshop. And what that will do is it'll process both images and it will bring them up as 2 layers. So I'm just going to move that out of the way. Now, the first thing you have to do is find out which order the layers are in. Now, clearly the top layer is the noise reduced layer. I tend to work with the sharpened layer above. I find it easier to do that. Can you see the difference, by the way, when I did that one? Huge difference between what's sharpened and what is noise reduced. Okay, so basic thing, same thing as before. Using the quick select tool, I'm just going to make a very, very quick selection of the bird. I'm going to show you can go in a little bit later, and I'm not going to try and select the beak just now, because I'm going to show that that can be done a little bit later. Okay, so I'm going to go in and to be a little bit careful if the background is a very, very similar color to the bird, because what this is doing is finding edges. Okay, something a bit like that, up like that. We might be able to get, no, I'm not going to risk it. You might be able to get the legs. Let's get the legs down there. No, let's remove the middle bit. As I say, it's not critical. This. Okay, no. All right, it's good enough, close enough for government work, that one. All right, same thing again, select a mask, rubbish selection, not a problem, because what we can do is we can increase the radius. We could then probably use the selection refinement here and just go in and see if we can add the tongue and the beak like that. And we can use the selection refinement around the back here as well. All right. Apply a feather. You'll get the idea. This is basically the same workflow I have on pretty well every image, and I'm going to go okay. And then turn that into a layer mask. So now if we go in, you'll now find you've got a beautifully sharp bird against a beautifully smooth background. All right, and again, if I wanted to finish that off which I'm not going to in this case. I might apply a vignette. One trick I will show you on this one, which is equally applicable to all techniques. If you find there are certain parts of your image that could do with a tiny little bit more extra sharpening, the sharpen tool in Photoshop used to be absolutely awful, but it's been improved enormously recently. So this is a technique. So for example, if I wanted to go in and make that eye just that little bit sharper, create a blank layer, choose the sharpen tool over here. The trick here is to get it set up right. You want mode normal, strength low, something like 10%, sample all layers, and critically protect detail. View it at 100%, and now all you have to do is to go in and paint over a few times those areas where you want to enhance the sharpness. Now let me try taking that layer on and off. It's probably too subtle to see on zoom, but that is what it's created on that layer. You can apply a little bit of extra sharpening all the way through. Just a very convenient way of doing it. You can apply a bit of extra sharpening to this as well. All right. One other thing I will demonstrate here is the fact that because this is a layer mask, bear in mind we've got a layer here which is, this is purely sharpened and the layer below is purely noise reduced. And at the moment we've got a very, very clear cut white black, but of course you could paint in here in grey or a very dilute white to add a bit of sharpness through to some areas of the foreground. So I'm going to take a paintbrush here, 10% opacity, white, and now what I can do is I can just paint. No, let's do it on the correct layer, shall we? We do it on the layer mask. Everybody makes that mistake. You do the painting on the wrong layer. What I'm doing here is I'm painting in very, very dilute white on the layer mask. Now what that's doing is gradually making the sharpened bit of this foreground visible and blending it with the noise reduced version. Just adds a little bit of sharpness to that foreground. And I say, you might or might not want to put a vignette on that one. Okay, let's do another one. And this time let's use the topaz denoise. So let's find an image which is pretty noisy. That one, I think that one was, what was that shot at? 2,500. Yeah. So as you can see, that's quite a lot of noise on that one. Now this is one of those things you can sometimes, and I say with images that are not too noisy, you can get away with a single pass on topaz. We'll try it with this one, but you can do it with two passes as well. Let's try it with a single pass. Okay, get the idea. Same. So we've got the Provia, got the color profile there. So let's get the tonality right. Crop first of all. Do we actually want to crop this image? We probably do a little bit. Let's just take that in a little bit. Let's just, there we are. Want to leave some of those raindrops because it was absolutely peeling down that particular day. Keep some of those raindrops. Let's get the tonality right. White balance is actually remarkably good out of the box, actually, certainly as I'm seeing it here. I don't know whether this is a red shank. I don't know whether they've got anything which is properly neutral. So let's just try and do it by eye. Let's get the color balance about right. That's looking about right. Okay, so let's get the tonality right. Push the same basic thing, push the exposure up or down, that gets the midtones about right, and then play around with either end of the histogram. So let's get the blacks right, let's get the whites right. And now we can play around with the shadows and the highlights. So we can try putting a little bit of detail, that's all right there, and the highlights, we may want to pull the highlights back a little bit. There we are, something a bit like that. Okay. Again, yeah, let me Okay. You wouldn't do this, but you could go in and clone out these rain spots if they happen to be dust spots. But obviously, I don't. I should have chosen an image which has dust spots in, but none of these do. So basic idea: turn the sharpening off, and then we're going to edit this in Photoshop. Edit in. So that hopefully has come through. There it is. Now we've now got that one in Photoshop. So you can. One of the things I haven't shown you yet, but I will with the last image that I show you. My normal workflow actually uses things called smart objects, which allows you to work non-destructively. I won't use a smart object for this just yet, but I will just duplicate the layer so we've got a reference for it. So with this one now, let's try pushing this through Topaz. So I'm going to go filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Denoise. Now this is not a tutorial on Topaz. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but basically it's got two modes. One which they've called Denoise AI, which is basically under user control, and another one called AI Clear, which has just got simplified controls. But actually that in itself is actually a very good illustration of why artificial intelligence is sometimes not quite so clever as it thinks it is. Because as you can see, there are some areas here where the noise has been reduced less than others. You see that some areas around here, I don't know whether this is coming across in Zoom or not, but there are some areas where it has applied noise reduction, but it hasn't done a terribly good job. And this is one of the issues about doing it in one pass, is that you've got to try and find or spot areas where the denoise has not been done properly. So these are the default settings. You can try and get it to auto detect what the settings should be. So I'm going to click that one and see what is a starting point. And actually, it's not half bad. It's a little bit plasticky on the noise reduction. But one of the things that this does extremely well is it does bring out the detail. It manages to remove noise without losing too much detail. And it also manages to get very well the sharp edges around things like beaks and such things. It's actually done quite a good job of this grass stalk as well, which is, in fact, that's really not bad out of the box. Let's have a quick look. Sometimes it doesn't redraw properly. Let's move down here. Yeah, actually, all I would suggest, having played around with this for a while, is make sure you look around the image, see whether there are areas that should be noise reduced that aren't, or look for things that are not handled properly, because sometimes it gets it wrong. So I've got quite a powerful computer, but it's still spending a long time generating those previews. So you can play around with these settings. My feeling is the out-of-the-box settings over-sharpen slightly, so I'm going to take the sharpening down a smidge. And I'm going to bring back some of that original detail. Now what this will do is it will stop the background looking horrendously over-smoothed. But you have to double check and make sure there aren't bits that, yes. And if you can see around that area there's a bit that has a bit of noise in it that hasn't been removed, because obviously the algorithm thinks that that's detail. So you might just want to turn the noise reduction up slightly and see what happens. Okay, let's go with that one. So that's essentially applying exactly the same technique, but in one pass. And if you're lucky and if you're careful, you might get away with doing that, a single image. But of course, there's nothing stopping you doing your denoise, your Topaz denoise, in two separate layers. And the final image I show you, because I'm aware that the time is ticking on, I'll show you another one which uses essentially the same noise reduction sharpening technique with the blending, but using topaz rather than using Nick. So let's just go in there. Yeah, so you might want to do a little bit of selective sharpening on that one, create a new layer, take that one, take the sharpening brush, just apply a little bit of selective sharpening around the eye, maybe around the beak. This works really well around beaks and claws and feathers and things like that one. There we are, something a bit like that, and maybe just apply a little bit more sharpening to the breast feathers. Okay. It doesn't require a great deal more. Yeah, that's the beauty of doing nature processing. Are you okay if I do one more, Anne? You're okay with that one? If I, and then we'll stop for questions.
Yeah, that's
this
fine.
one, when I finish doing this one, I will just make a comment or two about printing and the kind of things, extra things I might do if I was going to print this image. Is that okay? Right. That's
fine. Sorry.
Let's just close that one. Right, let's go back and let's find another image. I guess I ought to use the bittern on the grounds the bittern was used for the the flyer for the afternoon. So let's go to that one. And this is a classic case of an image that perhaps, other than the fact it's quite rare to actually capture one of these things flying, certainly for me to capture one of these things flying, you might otherwise have thrown it away as a raw file. It looks incredibly bland, the colour's awful, and it's not as critically sharp as one would have liked. Let's put it that way. There's a slight lack of detail. It's not bad, but it could be slightly crisper. So same basic idea. Let's work on this one. So basic. Let's get the color right. I would tend to go for neutral for nature pictures. It gives you much more leeway in terms of contrast and color. Close that one. Now this image clearly has got, it looks too cold. There are no blacks in it at all, which is why it all looks a bit wishy-washy, and there are no whites either. So let's just see where we are. The midtones do not look too bad. Let's have a look at the color first of all, working on the assumption that the beak on the bittern is reasonably neutral. Yeah, it's a little bit warm. Let's take that back a little bit. Something a bit like that. Right, let's crop. Because otherwise the histogram is like, you see that peak there on the histogram? That's the peak of the sky, and we don't care about the sky because we're about to crop it off. So let's, again, I'm assuming the same kind of aspect ratio. I think I printed this one 3:2. So let's stick to the same kind of aspect ratio. So something a bit like that. Okay. So there's the crop. Now we're seeing the histogram of just the cropped image. So let's see what it looks like with a solid black. Let's take those blacks down. That's already starting to look quite a bit better. Let's push the whites up a little bit. Okay, let's see what the, this was, these reeds were a very, very lovely kind of pale gold at the time. So let's just make sure we've got that lovely pale gold. It's a little bit warm still. Pull the shadows down, make sure the feathers stand out on the bittern. Blacks, that's all right. Losing a tiny bit of detail there. Okay, so that is a rough raw conversion. All I've done here is let's add a little bit more magenta because there was tree cover, so there'll be green light around. Okay, that is the basic raw conversion. There's nothing very much. I obviously I'd cleaned the sensor on this one. There's no sensor spots to remove. So same basic idea. Go into here, and we want detail. Turn the sharpening off, and then edit in Photoshop. Edit in Photoshop. Where are we? At the top. Right, this one I'm going to use or something close to the workflow that I would normally use, which involves using smart objects. Now, this is not a tutorial about smart objects, but it does have a huge advantage, smart objects, in that you are working you are working not entirely non-destructively within Photoshop. So you'll find that your filters will also work non-destructively as well. So here's the trick. You take the background, and I'm going to convert that background to a smart object, which essentially puts it within a protective wrapper. Think a bit like that. It's like putting it into an envelope, a protective envelope, and we can now do things to that envelope. Right, it's a bit like working in Lightroom. You can do things like lighten it, darken it, stretch it, you can blur it, you can do all those things, but it won't affect what's inside the envelope. They will not be changed. The other thing you can do, which is really rather nice, is you can duplicate these objects, and you are not actually duplicating the pixels. So again, it's a bit like the virtual copies within Lightroom. You are actually going to be, you are simply making two references to the same pixels underneath. Okay, and I'm going to apologize now because I've forgotten in my haste. I've not actually shown camera raw. I will very quickly show camera raw before we finish. Please remind me about that one. So we've got two layers now. Now I'm going to do the sharpening noise reduction trick here, but this time I'm going to use Topaz for it. So choose a layer now. If you choose a layer and it's a smart object, the filter will operate as a smart filter. So it'll operate on that layer and that layer only. So I'm going to go Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Denoise. So the layer below is the noise reduced layer. So we don't care about sharpening on this layer. We only care about noise reduction. So in this case, I'm going to turn the sharpening right down, and I'm just going to look at the smooth areas, because this is where noise is most visible, in the very, very smooth areas. Okay, and we can probably recover a little bit of that background detail. Something a bit like that. Okay, apply. So this is same basic principle. This one, I happen to know, I tried it. It doesn't work terribly well in its single pass AI mode, because it sees detail in these reeds and tries to sharpen them. And we don't want that. We only want the sharpening to be applied to the bit end. We don't want it to be applied to the reeds. So that's the denoise. So this one, we're now going to use Topaz Denoise, but we're going to use it as a sharpener rather than as a noise reducer. Yeah, this is something that I tried, and it seems to work really rather nicely. So Filter, Topaz Labs, Denoise. So now we're going to turn the remove noise off. Oh, this is now, give my computer a chance to, you can't hear it whirring away here. It's a pretty powerful machine, but it's struggling with this. Okay, so I've turned the remove noise off, all being well. Okay, and I'm just going to try turning the sharpen up a little bit. Okay, and let's bring the original detail back. All being well, we will start to see some of this feather detail coming out. Yeah, that's looking a lot better. And we don't care what it's doing to the background. We really do not care in the slightest bit. What we care about is what the bird looks like. All right, so let's move that sharpening up a little bit more. Okay, job done. Apply. So, same basic principle. We've now got a layer which is sharpened but not noise reduced, and the layer below it which is noise reduced but not sharpened. And let's say, I think, given it doesn't take that much longer, I will probably continue to use this technique rather than trying to do it all in one go, because otherwise you have to be very, very careful that there are not areas where the noise reduction or sharpening are being applied wrongly. So same basic idea, make a selection. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to make a selection roughly of the, now we're going to go in and paint this a little bit later. So I'm just going to go in, make sure it covers the feet behind and some of the wing. some of this wing is going soft anyway. And we'll do a little bit of the beak as well. We'll refine that when we go into select and mask. Okay, so let's get ourselves to 100%. Okay, I'm going to use the select and mask here just to tidy up that edge. We don't want to that bit in the middle to be in there. All right, so that's got that edge sorted. Move the radius up. I hope you're getting the idea that really I use the same workflow for all these images. There's very little changes. Apply a feather so that the edge isn't too abrupt, and then go OK. And now apply that as a layer mask. So now what we've got is a sharpened, possibly needs a little bit more sharpening, layer above a noise reduced layer. So we've got a lovely smooth background, and we've got a bird that could do with a little bit more selective sharpening. So that's the next trick and the last thing I would do on this particular image. And this is where the Photoshop sharpener, the sharpening tool, really comes into its own, because you can go in here and very, very carefully and very, very gently just brush in a little bit of extra sharpness around things like the beak, around the eye. Don't do it too much, otherwise you'll start to see halos. But you can just go in here. It works best on things like eyes, beaks, claws, anything with scales. Works well on plant leaves, anything like that. Go in, something like that. All right, job done. Right, okay.
Ian,
yes.
When you've done your conversion, can you also go and show what settings you'd have for the Photoshop noise filter somebody has asked? So could you do it in the...
You mean the one under filter noise?
Yeah.
I confess I don't use that. I wouldn't know where to start recommending, and until I'd experimented, I couldn't really tell you how to do that one. To be honest, you're better off to using the noise reduction. If you can do the noise reduction at the raw stage, you're doing an awful lot better, because you are only creating you're converting the pixels once, if you can get away with it.
Okay.
I would.
It's somebody we know, so you can we can take that.
Yeah, let's come back to that one. While we're on this image, we would. One of the things that was advertised, we're going to talk about printing. Now, at the moment, I've done no print sharpening at all, and I've done no other adjustments for printing. And this is something that I wanted to just to talk about a little bit, because an image that you produce like this will look good on a screen, a kind of monitor in front of you. It may actually look ever so slightly bright on a projector, depending on how the projector's set up. But if you make a print of this image, the print will look dull unless you put it under a very, very bright light. And so what I do, and what I've found right a long time ago, was that you do need to brighten or lift the midtones on images that you are going to print. And I'll show you the way I would normally do it. I'll demonstrate it using a curves layer, because that's effectively what's happening. Effectively what you're doing is this. So I'm hoping that most people looking are relatively au fait with how curves work, in that effectively you've got the input down the bottom, the output along the side, and the line tells you how the translation is done. So we've left the black and the white untouched. So you put black in, get black out, white in, white out. But if you put a mid-tone in, you get slightly brighter than mid-tone out. Excuse me. So this is a tone curve that is brightening the midtones, but leaving the highlights and the shadows untouched, or the blacks and the whites untouched. And that's what you need to do. You need to apply a tone curve that brightens the midtones before printing, and possibly, this depends on your projector, possibly darkens the midtones ever so slightly before projecting. Don't play around with the brightness, otherwise you lose blacks and whites. Just do it with the tone curve. Because it's easier to do it in an action, I've got a little action for it, which is, if I can find it, my default actions. No, I can't find it. Why can I never find something? It's always the same, isn't it? No, I've lost it. PDI competition. It's somewhere there, old zone stuff. I'll show you anyway. It's to create a levels layer. Levels is the easiest way of doing it on the grounds that you can actually you can take the gray point and you can actually type a number in there and you can save that number in an action. And I find for most printers, that value should be about somewhere between 1.1 and 1.2. So 1.15, something like that. So that's what it will look like. So try it on your own printers. I found that if you print that, subjectively, it will come out looking like that. Okay. So the final thing I just want to talk about, and I know I've overrun, and I will tell everybody that I'm always overrun because that's how.
You have till past. I haven't got that many questions yet, but they may come.
Okay.
In.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to save that image out. Now, when it comes to printing files, the thing about printing is that you do need to apply extra sharpening when you print. And the reason for that is that when ink falls onto paper, the droplets expand. It's like blotting paper. It goes, and so you end up, something that used to be a sharp edge ends up being a slightly fuzzy edge. And so what you end up doing is slightly over sharpening, so that when you print on something that blurs it slightly, you end up with something that's just right. Okay, for those people that send prints off to commercial printers like DS Color Labs, you do not need to do this final print sharpening. You send off what you've got here and that will be fine. But if you are going to an inkjet printer, you need to do final print sharpening. Now, I use a program which Anne is well aware of because I was the one who introduced her to it, called QImage. And for those that haven't met it, it's well worth having a look at. QImage is a program that only does printing, nothing else, and it does it absolutely superbly. In particular, it gets what's called the interpolation. You have to, when you send an image off to a printer, it has to be scaled up to the native resolution of the printer. And that's where all your artifacts come from. Because normally what happens if you give an image to the printer that's the wrong size, then the printer driver, which is a really stupid piece of software coming from Epson or Canon or HP or wherever, does a very, very naive upscale. And that's where all your blockiness and your zigzags and things like that come from. It comes from giving the printer the wrong sized image. And QImage does a superb job. It used to be Windows only. There is now a cross-platform version called QImage 1. And it's basically a cut-down version of this one, but to all intents and purposes, as far as printing is concerned, it is equivalent and it produces some superb results. So I can thoroughly recommend QImage for printing. If you haven't got QImage or don't want to buy more software and you have Lightroom, Lightroom is actually a very close second when it comes to printing. It has a thing called the print module over here. And this is not a tutorial on the print module, but providing you set your printer up right, you will get a really, really good result. So this is the trick. The trick is to set the print resolution correctly for your printer. So pencil and paper handy. If you have an Epson printer, that number should be 720. If you have a Canon printer, it should be either 600 or 1200, depending on the model. And if you have an HP printer, it should be 1200. Now you'll get a warning thing here saying, my God, this file's going to be big when you blow it up to 600 ppi, and if it's an A3 print or whatever, doesn't matter. Computers have got lots of memory nowadays. The point about this is if you present the printer driver with a file which is exactly the right size for printing, like not a pixel more, not a pixel less, then it says, thank you very much, and it prints it. It doesn't do any scaling, it doesn't do any processing, it just passes it straight through. Now that means that anything that's been done beforehand, it's not going to be mangled by the printer driver. So set that number right. 720, 600, 1200, depending on your printer. The second thing to set right here is print sharpening, and this is why it's worth using this technique. It's a technique that QImage uses too, which is that what you don't want to do is sharpen first and then scale up. Because what you're doing, if you do that, is when you apply sharpening, you are applying, you're going to create halos. You can't avoid it. It puts light and dark halos around sharp edges. That's how sharpening works. If you do that first and then you enlarge it, then you're enlarging all the sharpening halos. Right? So what this does and what QImage does is it enlarges first and then sharpens. So your sharpening halos are absolutely tiny, and they are at the scale that you have just enlarged your image at. All right, so you end up with a lovely crisp print, which is never going to have any sharpening halos on it. Okay, so so basically all you do is you say how much sharpening you want, low, standard or high. Try it on your printer. It's going to depend on the type of paper. It's going to depend on your tastes. And the other one is the media type, which is the matte or glossy, and that's because matte paper usually requires slightly more sharpening than glossy paper because it's more porous, the ink spreads more. So that's how you would set your printer up in printing in Lightroom. Okay, one more thing I did promise, and I'm not actually going to do this, but I want to just to show you that the Adobe Camera Raw, the RAW converter within Photoshop, is just the same as the one in Lightroom. So we haven't done a puffin yet. Let's have a puffin. All right. So same basic idea. Profile, exactly the same as before. You've got the profile choice up here. So I'm going to choose Provia here. Thank you very much. You've got what would have been tabs down the right-hand side of Lightroom end up being tabs along the top. So you've got the detail tab, you've got the hue saturation tab, split toning tab, lens corrections tab. So we've got the chromatic aberration things there. That's the detail tab, and you've got the basic tab, which is things like, let's try and get now the white balance dropper isn't there, it's up here. So we choose the white balance tool, and we assume that the puffin has got relatively white plumage, which it had. Same basic idea with the histogram up here. So again, you can move the sliders. If you hold the Alt key down, it will show you where you're clipping, just like the Lightroom one. So in this case, move the blacks in so we get a solid black. Move the whites up. It's looking slightly too warm, slightly too red actually. Let's knock that down to 15, and we'll knock that down. Something a bit like that. Let's see what the shadows look like. Pull the highlights back, make sure we've got lots of detail on the bird's breast feathers. Move the whites up, something a bit like that. So all I've done there is exactly the same as I would have done in Lightroom. And in terms of going into Photoshop, same thing, go to the Details tab, move the sharpening to 0 and go Open Image. So we are now at exactly the same position as we would have been if we'd done this in Photoshop. Okay, so it is the same software under the hood, it's just a different user interface onto it. Okay, let me just check my notes, see if there's anything that I have obviously missed. So I've talked final. Oh yes, there's one thing that I will hopefully, and we'll make these available afterwards. One of the things that I wanted to, where's my Lightroom gone? There, let's go back to the grid view. If you haven't discovered any of these, there are some very, very good standard test images out there. And they are standard in the sense that they are very, very well known, and the colors and tonality on those images are absolutely accurate. So in other words, if you can work with these pictures and you can view them on the screen and they look good, and you can print them and they look good, then not only have you got your printer and well, you basically you get a nice warm feeling from the fact that you've got your monitor and your printer well calibrated. And the problem with doing that kind of thing with your own images is you don't know whether, let's say there's a color cast, you don't know if it's in the raw processing stage from the camera, you don't know if it's in your monitor, you don't know if it's in your printer. This helps you to narrow it down, because if you can view an image on your screen and the colors look accurate, so that's a classic one. It's got a Greentag Macbeth chart, it's got detail into the very, very deep shadows, it's got almost blown highlights, it's got 4 different types of skin tones, it's got natural colors like fruit and flowers and things like that. Lots of things for you to look at. Try them. I think we can make these available, Anne, if you want to, because they're well worth having. And there are black and white ones here, black and white ones with step, which is less relevant for nature photography. But that one is a particularly useful one. There's that one which contains monochrome, another one which contains color and monochrome. So yeah, these are very, very good, worthwhile things to add to your arsenal. Okay. I think I'm just about done, if that's all right. I did overrun, I do apologise.
No, you're okay. It's scheduled till past. If you have a few minutes, would it be possible to go through the actual detail and noise in the raw converter, what settings you'd have for the detail somebody's asked?
Sure,
Enhanced
yes.
detail in Lightroom, because I think there are 1 or 2 people on board who don't have Photoshop. They may have elements.
Right. Okay.
So they're asking what, if you're only going to do Lightroom or ACR, well, no, that and elements, what settings would you use?
Okay, right. If you only have elements, the only thing you're limited on is the fact you can't work 16-bit. You'll be stuck to working 8-bit. But given you've done all your tonal and color adjustments in the raw converter, that's not a problem. That you'll still be able to do the sharpening noise reduction trick in elements. So that's that. The real issue is, what if you don't have Photoshop and you only have the plugins? So let's go back to an image, a raw file. So let's pick an image, any image.
Or even if you have no plugins, just what is the best you could do with just using Lightroom?
Okay, the best you could do just using Lightroom. Right. Let's see what we can do here. Is a classic dull. Oh, hang on. What have we done here? I've lost my. There we are. That's better. Let's develop. Okay. So I'm going to try and do this only in Lightroom. Only in Lightroom. Let's set the. So let's make sure that's reset back to its defaults. Make sure the lens correction is set. That's fine. Okay. So, same basic principle. Let's set the color. This is set to neutral. You don't have to choose neutral. Just choose one that is going to give you a good starting point. Right. Adobe Vivid is clearly a bad place to start. It's way too saturated and way too contrasty. Camera matching, standard might be reasonable. I like neutral for nature pictures, so that's the one that I've chosen here. Okay, let's crop. First of all, let's get a crop in here so we get proximate. Now this is one where I probably want to letterbox it slightly. So something a bit like that. So it's, yeah, for the anal retentives among you, of which I count myself, this is not a rule of thirds. This is a golden ratio, and I always use the golden ratio rather than the rule of thirds for composition. I think it works much better. Right. So let's have a look. If you look at the Ash Shop color profile, it's way too magenta. Look at that, plus 20 magenta. So let's see if those feathers are approximately neutral. Yeah, a little bit yellow. So let's just take that yellow down a little bit, 5250, something like that. There would have been quite a lot of green there. Now let's get the brightness about right. Push the white point up, push the black point down. Okay, now let's just see where we are in terms of, so I'm just going to hold the highlights down to make sure I've got lots of detail in the wing here, push the whites back up. Okay, push those mid-tones up slightly. Now, if you are only going to be working in Lightroom and you want to work selectively, then one of the things you could do is you could apply using the brush or something like that. Let's just see if the masking works, because that's one of the things that that's what I want to. Let's try 15, something like that. So let's see if how that works. Right. So it's reasonable. It's a reasonable start. Okay, so let's now go to the sharpening. Now, if you only do it in Lightroom, then you've probably got no choice but to use the masking. Okay, now what masking does is allows you to control where the sharpening is applied. And this is the really nice thing. If you hold the Alt key down with the masking and then drag it to the right, it'll show you what's going to be sharpened. So I'm going to, I don't want to sharpen the background. I only want to sharpen the bird really and the foreground. So I'm going to leave it like that. So now in principle, what I should be able to do, I want to go to 100%. I should be able to, as I say, I tend to prefer taking the radius down slightly, maybe 0.5, 0.6, something like that, and pushing the amount up. But because I have used the masking, now, actually, it's worked pretty well here. What you've got to be careful of if you use masking is that you often see an extra line around edges, because what you're seeing the boundary between what is sharpened and what isn't sharpened. Okay, that's essentially what's happening here. Detail is essentially doing a different kind of transform. It's called a deconvolution, and what it's trying to do is remove blurring out of the lens. So what you can try and do is, it's actually using a high pass filter by the look of it. Again, I'm holding the Alt key down. The Alt key will always do something interesting, and this is showing you the bits where the extra detail is being applied. There, so, and the radius also. So if I move the radius right up, you can see horrible halos appearing. If you can keep that radius right down, you are going to keep the halos at bay. Okay, so in this case, we've not sharpened the background, so it hasn't sharpened that noise. We could apply a tiny little bit of noise reduction, tiny little bit. Now, the final touches here would be the selective sharpening that I was using with the Photoshop sharpen tool. You can do that using this brush here. So there is a sharpness slider here. So reset everything. Put the sharpness up. Do not worry about what value it's at yet. All we want to do now is change where we are going to apply the sharpening. So I'm going to just go and paint some sharpening around the beak. If you select the mask overlay, I've got this currently set, so what have we got to? Flow is 100, okay. So this is showing you where you have painted. Okay, and we can turn the density down a little bit and maybe paint some more sharpening on these feathers down here, and maybe a bit more up on those wing feathers, something like that. Now, don't worry about the fact that we can't actually see what we're doing yet. That's something that will come later. Okay, so turn the overlay off, because now what we can do is we can now play around with that sharpness. We can push that sharpness up or down. You can see, really obvious if I pull the sharpness right down, but that's now applying selective sharpening to the eye and the beak and a little bit of the feathers. You can also apply selective clarity if you want to do, I haven't mentioned it, but the other thing that's worth doing, if you have a very sunny day, which clearly this wasn't because it was piddling down, on a very sunny day, if part of what your subject is in sun and part of it's in shade, then the bit that's in shade will be very blue. So you can use this for applying a little bit of corrective white balance, just to add a little bit of yellow into those areas where there is shade. So let's go back to where we were. Let's close the selection. If you wanted to apply a vignette in Lightroom only, then that's under Effects, and you want the post-crop vignette, and we want to pull it down very, very slightly, and you can set the roundness. You want it to be pretty round. You can change the feather, how much it's feathered. So something a bit like that. Okay, so that is, it's not quite doing the same blending of noise reduction and sharpening as you would do in Photoshop, but that is done entirely in Lightroom, and it's got very similar effect. Yeah, does that help to answer the question?
I hope so. We shall find out. Yeah.
Any other questions came in while I was rabbiting on? Has John opened his bottle yet?
I don't know. Someone was asking, could you quickly repeat how you get the white or black background?
Yeah. For both Photoshop and Lightroom, all you do is right-click in the background area, and it gives you a choice of what color you want.
Okay.
It's that simple. Oh, for Photoshop, it is slightly more complex to get white. Because what you have to do in Photoshop is go, there isn't a white option. I have absolutely no idea why not. You've got to go select custom color and then choose a color. You can have a turquoise background if you really wanted to. I wouldn't recommend it. But if you select white as the custom color, then that is there. And then you can always change it to mid-gray, or you can change it to black. So. Oh. Black for projection, white for prints, I would humbly suggest.
Okay, somebody asked, just to repeat, that QImage does have a version for the Mac now.
It does, but it's from a different company. The company is called Binartem, BINARTEM, and it's called QImage 1. And it is a re-implementation. It's not a port. It's a re-implementation of basically the best bits out of QImage, and it's cross-platform. It works on Windows and it works on Macs, and it is superb. I cannot recommend it highly enough. If you're serious about printing, it will do things like it gets the scaling right, it gets borders right, it gets key lines right, it gets crop marks right. It just does printing properly. So I would thoroughly recommend it.
Somebody asked, but you may not know this, they said they wondered where you found out the pixel for printing on the Canon.
I found it from QImage.
100S.
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. You can, okay, certainly for the full version of QImage, and I believe for QImage 1, you can download a trial version. Almost all software's got trial versions. And that's where I found it out from. Because one of the things that QImage does is it interrogates the printer to find out what its native resolution is.
You don't know otherwise.
Sorry?
You don't know otherwise.
No, but I can tell you now, all Epson printers are 720.
It was a Canon Pro 100S.
That will be, well, you'll be safe with 600. If it's got the super high resolution version, you might need 1200. It'll be either six. I've got the Pro 1000 behind me, nice and tidy, Jonathan, nice and tidy, and that's either 600 or 1200, depending on whether you have the super high resolution version or not.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry, somebody asked why use, just quickly, I think this will be the last one, why use Lightroom at all if the processes are identical in Photoshop and you're transferring in it?
Because cataloging. I much prefer Lightroom's cataloging to Bridge. I hate Bridge with a vengeance. And as I say, and nowadays I use Capture One for the same reason. But the thing is, it brings it all under one roof. That's why you can do. I also prefer its layout. I much prefer the layout here to the layout on camera. So yeah, just personal preference. Same code.
Yeah.
Any more for any more?
I think we ought to stop there. I mean, for one thing, you need to get on with your afternoon. I'm sure a lot of other people do. So, I mean, I shall just thank Ian and thank everyone else for attending. Any comments, welcome. And we will email you with however we decide to share the recording and those test images. The only thing I would add is that Ian didn't press greatly getting your monitor profile, but this is one of the essentials.
You're quite right. I kind of took it for granted that this audience would. No, it's really, really important. You've got to have a calibrated monitor, and if you're printing yourself, there are plenty of paper manufacturers, not just Permajet, but there are also Photospeed and plenty of others that will produce you printer profiles as well. Get everything calibrated.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll finish there. I don't know whether I think if you want to stop the recording, Duncan, and then we can